The word is cannibal, and you spell it C-A-N-N-I-B-A-L. Well, a cannibal is, originally it's the idea of eating human flesh.
The cannibal for a modern person is, of course, someone who eats human flesh, and we think about this in terms of anthropology.
And then we've kind of moved it to animals, so that animals who eat their own kind, you can have cannibal bears and so on and so forth. And of course it's become a metaphor in many senses too. We can cannibalise texts or cars or all sorts of things. Well, we can date where it comes from fairly precisely in one sense, in the sense of the actual word, and that is Christopher Columbus. So the word comes into English and into French, Cannibal, from the Spanish, because although Christopher Columbus was an Italian, he was working for Isabella of Castile when he went out to try and travel the world and found America for Europe. He found cannibals, or he believed he found cannibals. And the word cannibal, it has two sort of sources that feed into it, if you like. When the early explorers went out, they thought they'd find all kinds of wonders and marvels, including dog-headed men. So the Latin word for dog, canis, from which we get canine, like the canine teeth for tearing at the flesh. So the idea of canis, dog, and the dog-headed men was one of the sort of potential roots into this word cannibal, but the main root is from Carib or Caribou, and those are the native peoples in the West Indies, in the Caribbean. So before you had Europeans invading the Caribbean and bringing African slaves to work the land, you had these Caribs. So if you read a story like Robinson Crusoe, where you have Robinson on a desert island in the Caribbean, then he finds Man Friday, who is of course the good Carib, the one who you can turn into a slave and make into a Christian and all the rest of it. But he's rescuing Man Friday from the ferocious cannibals. And so there's this idea that the Caribs were cannibals that we get, say, dating right back to 1492 in Christopher Columbus.
There's a very famous essay by a 16th century writer by the name of Michel de Montaigne, a French essay writer who wrote in the second half of the 16th century. He writes an essay about cannibals that's very complicated in a way, because it seems on one level to be an essay about tolerance. It's about, and Montaigne is reading some of the accounts of people coming back from the New World. He even says that he met some cannibals or some people from the New World in, he doesn't say it, but it would have to have been in 1560. And these people, at the end, are given, and this is a device that happens a lot in literature, they're told to ask questions about the French society in which they find themselves. And Montaigne, being very sly, says, well, they asked me two questions. Actually, they asked me three questions, but I can only remember two of them. So I'm really sorry about that, but I can only remember two of them. One is about the ethics of living in society, why it is that there are poor people and rich people. One is about the monarchy, which is to say, why is it that the king, who at that time is a very young child, essentially, is guarded by all of these strong men, and why doesn't one of those strong men decide to take the king's place? And the third question, which is left out implicitly, is a question about religion.
Well, it is so hard to tell whether anybody was ever a cannibal, because cannibalism always tends to be in the past and some other people. Lots of anthropologists will say that there is no people in the world who don't have a story about their enemies being cannibals. You always tell stories about the cannibalism of your enemies, and you can see that right up to sort of World War I or World War II, where we have the Huns roasting babies and so on. Or to give an 18th century example, or late 18th century, Napoleon Bonaparte, Boney, people would tell stories to their children in England that Boney would come and get them and eat them if they weren't good.
The problem here is, on the one hand, we have this discourse about the cannibals are in many ways admirable. They have savage practices, but so do we, actually, in Europe. This is a time of religious war. And one of the points that Montaigne makes is that we say that these cannibals are really barbarous, but look what we're doing to each other. But another part of it is that the civil wars are about Protestants versus Catholics. And one of the central tenets of Catholic faith is, of course, the transubstantiation of the host into the body of Christ. And so in the time that this essay is being written, Protestants use this idea of the transubstantiation of the host as a way of talking about how horrible the Catholics are. Look, they're terrible, and they actually eat their God. So in some sense, you could think of the question that the cannibals are asking is, well, you criticize us for eating human flesh, but you eat your God.
There certainly are acts of cannibalism that exist. I mean, I think anthropologists tend to divide cannibalism into, broadly speaking, two kinds. One is survival cannibalism and one is ritual cannibalism. So survival cannibalism is quite well attested on the part of all peoples, including English people, French people, and so on and so forth. I mean, the typical example in the 18th century is the shipwreck, that in a shipwreck there will be likely cannibalism. Our own modern day version of that tends to be the plane crash, like the famous one in the Andes. Ritual cannibalism is rather different, and that's one of the things that fascinated travellers to the New World. And while on the whole descriptions of cannibalism tend to be very hostile descriptions, you know, it's our enemies, these are evil people. I would say that the stigma is greater now than it used to be. I think we have a sort of perverse fascination with cannibalism as a perverse taste, if you like, the kind of Hannibal Lecter figure.
One of the interesting things, again in the Christian theological context, which for me is very important because I work in the early modern period, is that Christianity is an unusual religion in that it emphasizes the resurrection of the flesh. And so very, very early on in Christianity, you have a problem which is posed, which is, well, let's say that I'm eaten by an animal, and then someone eats that animal. So bits of the matter that used to be me pass into someone else's body. Well, what happens at the Last Judgment? What happens when my flesh is resurrected? This is a question which may seem kind of silly, but if you actually have a religion where you take very, very seriously the notion of the resurrection of the flesh, then it's a real mind real mind twister. What is it I'm going to do with this? Strangely, the question of cannibalism or eating other people is linked from at least the 2nd century AD in the nexus of theology and philosophy, because the two come very much together with the question of cannibalism. And so this is another way that the question of cannibalism interests me.
As you say that your enemies or people you don't like are always cannibals, there were many stories about the Jews being cannibals. And I think one of the problems with stories about cannibalism is that we use metaphors and figures of cannibal practices all the time. We talk about man-eaters and so on. And we used to talk about blood-sucking Jews in the sense of the figure of the Jew as a usurer, which was very, very powerful at the time. And if you look at Shakespeare's Shylock, then you have an example of the man who wants his pound of flesh, the metaphor but made literal, and I think there's a very clear reference there to this myth of the Jews as cannibals. The other example from Shakespeare is, of course, The Tempest, where Caliban is a kind of transposition of cannibal, people would say, and that is taking place in the Caribbean.
What do you eat? What part of a human do you eat when you're a cannibal?
Well, I think you could eat any part of a human, but just like any part of a pig. But the myths of cannibalism tend to divide into the kind of grilling, roasting myths, the kind of human being on a spit, like a pig, and the pot. There's a fascination with the cannibal pot. And when we have illustrations of cannibals, they tend to fall into those two categories.